Hi, I'm Patrick Scott, and welcome to PLS 101, American Democracy and Citizenship. Today we're going to be talking about some of the introductory material that's found in the first chapter of the text. We'll be talking about different meanings of democracy, how our political system compares with other democratic political systems that you may find, for example, in many European democracies. And we're also going to be talking about purposes of government, the role of government, and finish up the discussion of political ideologies and a discussion of the majoritarian versus pluralist models of governance. So we have a fair amount on our plate today, and we'll see how far we go. But first of all, as I had mentioned in the introductory material to begin with, one of the points that I've made is that in a lot of classes you may see a real close connection between what's going on the outside and what's going on in class. In some classes that you take here at Missouri State, you'll see a real close connection. Other classes, you'll see a very, very distant connection. And that is the material that you cover in the class is not really that much related to what you see reinforced on a daily basis in your world around you. Well, I think of all the classes you take here at Missouri State, definitely this class is one of those that clearly shows a close match between what we talk about inside the class, in the lectures, and the material that we cover, and what you see going on around you. And one of the things I want to urge you to do is to make it a point to stay informed in terms of the news that you watch on TV or read in the papers, and especially focus on political news and see how what you're reading about is reinforced by what we talk about in the class. If you do that, I think, again, you'll see a very, very close connection between the two. Now, that brings me into the point here is, why do we need to learn about government? Why is that important? Well, one of the reasons why I think it's important is because we see government all around us. Oftentimes we take it for granted. Oftentimes we take our political system for granted, that democracy is, we think we know more than we really do. But government really is all around us. It affects our lives in many ways. It's very pervasive and very commonplace. And we see it around us all the time, but often we don't even think anything of it. Now, I wanted to share with you, like, for example, just a little vignette about going to McDonald's and just showing you how, as an example, how we see government, the pervasiveness of government all around us. So, let's say that you're going to McDonald's to buy a hamburger. You're going to leave your house or apartment, and that house or apartment has been built according to local building codes to make sure you're safe, make sure that things aren't falling in, and those are examples, of course, of government decisions, government policies, government regulation. Those building codes were created by government. Why? To protect your safety. Now, let's say that you get into your car and you're driving down the street, and your car, if it's a relatively newer model, has many safety features. Obviously, for example, automatic airbags. And you'll find that, again, why is it that your car has all these built-in safety features? I mean, the more safety features you put into your car, the more expensive your car is going to be. And so why are all these safety features in there? Again, because of government regulation. Government decision makers decided that it was important for you to have these kinds of features in your car to protect your safety. These are required by government. Now, the streets on which you drive, the stop signs that you see, the speed limit signs, the traffic signals you see all around you are there because of some government entity putting them there to regulate traffic flow and to ensure safety of people who are using these streets. Now, once you get to McDonald's, you happen to notice a sticker on the wall indicating that this restaurant has been inspected. and it has been found free of rodent and insect infestation. And you're thinking, well, that's good to know, right? Well, who inspected this restaurant? Public health officials. But again, why do they do it? For health and safety purposes. On the wall, you happen to also see a certificate indicating that this property is licensed to operate as a business. Well, who granted a license to this business? And again, that would be government, in this case, the local government or municipality. Then you're going to give your orders to a person whose minimum wages and maximum working hours are set by government and whose wages are reduced by mandatory deductions for income tax and Social Security. Now, after you've enjoyed your meal, you feel the need to visit one of the restrooms. You will find one oversized stall designed for those who are physically challenged. So again, these are all examples that we see government around us. Other examples here, our university. Because we're a public university, we're part of the state government of Missouri. Did you go to a public school as a child? And then chances are, you were attending what they call a government-run school. Do you happen to have student loans? Probably, if you do, they are probably subsidized by the federal government or by the Missouri government to help make sure that the rate that you're paying is below market rate. All right, so you're probably paying less interest on that loan and more favorable conditions for paying off that loan than you might normally be able to get from a private bank. So the point here is that our lives are constantly governed by government. We are not officially born until we have a birth certificate. We must attend school up to a certain age. We cannot engage in many occupations without a license from the state. We cannot be declared legally dead without a death certificate. And guess what? It doesn't even end there. We can be buried only in government-approved cemeteries, and our estate taxes must be paid. So from cradle to grave, government is with us every step of the way. And yet, so much of that, of course, we often take for granted. Now, besides the fact that government is pervasive, and I'd like for you to try to do that as an experiment, when you go out today, just look around you and see the different ways in which you see how government's operating in your life. Now, some of the ways in which our system is different from other democracies is often a good use to compare how our system operates, because again, we as Americans kind of pretty much take our system for granted, and we think maybe because we're a democracy, all democracies are like our democracy. And yet, what's really interesting is that our democracy is rather unique compared to many other European democracies. So let's compare in some different ways and show you how our system differs from our cousins across the Atlantic, such as, for example, again, in Great Britain and others. So first of all, let me share with you in terms of in the United States, the police and the public schools tend to be controlled more often at the local and state level. There is, of course, some federal intervention too, but they tend to reside more primarily at the local level. And in Europe, by contrast, police and public school functions or education functions tend to be controlled more by the national government. What about political parties? Are there a lot of political parties here in the United States, or is there just two? Now, on first glance, you might think, well, there's just only two, there's Republicans and Democrats. But really, and truthfully, there are many political parties here. Now, are these political parties here in the United States powerful and very active? Or is it dominated by the Republicans and Democrats? And of course, you would say it's dominated by the Republicans and Democrats. And that's correct. We have here a broad-based two-party system, all right? Now, and that means in our country, there is no large socialist or communist or Labor Party or Marxist party. But in a number of European countries, these kinds of parties are large and very powerful. Okay? And now, by contrast, again, we have a number of parties here, but they are not very, very powerful. And instead, we have largely a broad-based two-party system. Now, essentially what that means here is you can look at in our system, you can look at the Democratic Party and the Republican Party as two big tents that are operating, and they try to encourage the voters to belong to one party or the other. There's a lot of overlap in terms of their positions. There are clearly distinctions between the two, but there's also a lot of overlap. And when we talk later on about political parties, you'll see that what parties want to do is to get your vote. And they say, for example, that can you be, let me show you as an example, can you be pro-life and be a Democrat? Can you be pro-choice and be a Republican? And the answer is clearly yes. Now, you might see more people who are pro-life who are in the Republican Party and who are conservative, and more people who are liberal and, say, pro-choice in the Democratic Party. But you can be a liberal Republican. You can be a conservative Democrat. In a lot of ways, the parties are more concerned about winning elections and getting you to participate and getting you to belong. So they are willing, as we'll talk about this later, they are willing to trade off some of their core beliefs in order to get your vote. All right? Now, I bring that up because that's where the nature of our party system here in America. In many European countries, you basically have a lot of parties that are operating, and they are very narrow. They're kind of ideological, which basically means that they're not willing to trade off their beliefs for more votes. They don't really care about getting more votes if they have to water down their core beliefs or values. And so, the nature of our parties, how they operate in our country versus many European countries, is quite different, quite distinct. And again, as we talk about political parties down the road, one of the reasons why is because the nature of the game, the way that we set up our rules here versus the way the rules will operate over there, determine whether or not you'll have a broad-based two-party system or multi-parties that are operating. Okay? Now, also along the same lines, the nature of voters. If you look at the voters here in the United States, and if you ask them, what do they believe and so forth, you'll find that that they're very different from the kind of voters that you'll see in many European parliamentary democracies. And as an example of that, over the past 50 years or so, there's been this phenomenon called the rise of the independent voter. Now, that doesn't mean that there's a voter part of an independent party, but rather the idea is this, is that the voters today in America are willing to vote in one election for a Republican and another election for a Democrat. Depending upon the issues and the candidates, they're happy to switch their party allegiances. Okay, now again, we have some people who are diehard Democrats that'll never change their beliefs, and there's some of the diehard Republicans. But you have a lot of voters in the moderate area, sort of that gray area, that middle ground, that in one election will end up voting for Republican candidates, and in another election end up voting for Democratic candidates. That's what we mean by the idea of the rise of the independent voter. If I were to ask your grandparents 50 years ago or so, how many of you would identify strongly with one political party or the other, your grandparents would definitely raise their hands and say, definitely I'm a Democrat or definitely I'm a Republican. And today, if I'm asking you in a classroom, how many of you strongly identify with one party or the other, you have a few people who actually identify with one or the other, but most people actually don't. Okay, that's what we mean by the rise of the independent voter. And again, by contrast, voters in many European countries don't feel this way. They are really strongly and solidly attached to the party that they belong. I'm a Labor Party member. I'm a member of the Christian Democrats. I'm a member of the Socialist Party. And they're very strong and in terms of their attachment to the values of that party. And they don't vote for other parties willy-nilly like we do here in America. Some other examples in terms of a contrast. Let's say in terms of when a treaty is signed. When a treaty is signed by the Prime Minister, the entire nation in European democracies are bound by that. And yet, here in America, when the President signs a treaty with another country, it does not guarantee anything will even happen because the Senate has to ratify that treaty and it has to be done and approved with a 2/3 vote. And along the same lines here, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later too, but in terms of how we set up our legislature, we deliberately separated the executive from the legislative branches, where in the many European parliamentary democracies, by definition, the executive and the legislative branches are wedded together. And that's a very important distinction too, because by having, and how that works basically is that the people will choose the legislature. So the party that dominates the parliament over there, they get to choose who the executive is going to be. That's like our Congress being able to choose our president. And that's not what we have, obviously. But if you have the dominant party in the legislature being able to choose the chief executive, in this case the Prime Minister, what that basically means is that the Prime Minister will always be of the same party as that legislature, right? As the dominant party in the legislature. And that always means this too, is that whatever that Prime Minister wants is what that legislature wants, and they march lock and step here, okay? So because they are wedded together. And by contrast here in our system, we have not a parliamentary system, but a presidential system. We have a separation where we have the president elected separately by the people and Congress elected separately by the people. And what that means is that the president could be a member of one party and Congress could be controlled by another party. And when you have a situation like that, you often have a phenomenon that we call here in the United States divided government. And that's when one party controls the White House, another party controls the Congress. And when that happens, it's often very, very difficult to get things done. So in a lot of ways, it's easier for legislation to get done, passed, and implemented in many European countries as opposed to here in the United States. We're much less efficient. Our founding fathers deliberately designed a much more inefficient system here in the United States, making it harder to get things done, but they did that for a purpose. Now, other differences here, what about in terms of taxes? Do you think you pay too many taxes? Of course you do. We all think we pay too many taxes, right? Well, in a lot of ways, we pay about half the taxes compared to many European countries. For example, in Sweden and Norway and others, they pay a lot more in the way of taxes than we do here in America. But at the same time, what do they get as part of that process? Well, they get, for example, health care. They don't have to pay significant out-of-pocket expenses for health care or for education. So they get something with that, but again, they're also heavily taxed in the process, and that is a trade-off. So again, a big, big difference in terms of our views about how much we should be paying to support government versus what you see in many European countries. Now, lastly, along the same lines, similar lines, is in terms of ownership, government playing a role in our society here. It deals with the idea of government ownership of industries. Here, the U.S. government really owns very few industries, but in much of Europe, the government owns the airlines, the telephone systems, the steel mills, for example, the automobile factories, and the oil companies. And again, so you have much more government ownership of major key sectors of the economy, and therefore much more government influence of key sectors of the economy. And as compared to our country, where we've often been characterized by this notion of laissez-faire capitalism, and that is there should always be sort of an arm's length distance between government and the economy. Government can regulate the economy to some degree, but it should have largely a hands-off role and let the sort of the invisible hand guide the marketplace, guide the allocation of resources in our society. So those are some key differences here. Even though we're a democracy and many European countries across the Atlantic are also democracies, we're all democracies, but we have very different kinds of democracies operating here. All right, and again, so what we take for granted, when European citizens come over here, they see a very, very different kind of democracy at work than what they're accustomed to. Now, speaking of democracy, it's probably a good idea to talk about different meanings of democracy. And so we're going to talk about a direct democracy and a representative democracy. But before we even do that, let me talk about one that's not really a democracy, but it was one that many former communist countries used to employ. And they use this notion of democratic centralism. Democratic centralism is a term used in reference to governments, communist governments in the past. And what they would say is this: a government is democratic if it serves, quote, the true interest of the people, whether or not the people have any say in those decisions. So if I'm a member of the government and I'm telling you as a citizen that you have to have, there's a curfew coming and you have to be in by midnight, and if you're not, we're going to assume that you're a criminal, we're going to shoot you on sight. I mean, these are the kinds of things saying we're serving the true interests of society because we know that we're protecting the safety of our citizens by imposing a curfew. And so the bottom line here is once the decision has been made by government, all people must abide by those decisions. And it's kind of interesting too because you see, for example, some former communist countries like East Germany used to be under control by the Soviet Union, and it used to be called the German Democratic Republic. Why was it called the German Democratic Republic? Because it practiced a form of democratic centralism. Now again, that's not really anywhere close to what our notions of democracy are. Instead, something that's more closely akin to our conception of democracy is this idea of direct democracy. And the idea of direct democracy is all citizens, or at least the vast majority of citizens, will participate in the major decisions that are being made. And we get that notion all the way back from ancient Greece, when you had the Greek city-states operating. All the citizens of Greece, and really this was basically the men, would come together and vote on major and decide major courses of actions for their governments. We see that in operation here today in the United States in terms of the New England Town Meeting. A lot of towns in New England and some other places throughout the U.S. actually have this idea where the citizens come together and vote on major issues or expenditures. So that's the idea of direct democracy at work. Now, other ways in which we see direct democracy in operation today are notions that we use in terms of legislation that we vote on. For example, a referendum and an initiative. Let me talk about both a referendum and initiative as an example of direct democracy at work. A referendum basically is an issue that's placed on the ballot, and voters are asked to approve or reject a specific policy or issue. Shall we start doing this? Shall we not do this? These are the kinds of things. Now, what a referendum basically does is that a referendum is placed on the ballot by the legislature. The legislature decides, saying, we're going to let the voters decide on this piece of legislation. All right. Now, an initiative is like a referendum. It's proposing a new piece of legislation or maybe an amendment to the Constitution. But again, it is an idea or something that's put on the ballot. But in this case, it's not put on the ballot by the legislature, but it's put on the ballot by citizens. So the citizens actually may initiate a petition to get something on the ballot. So that's the difference between a referendum and an initiative. They're both forms of direct democracy at work where citizens are asked to make decisions on a major piece of legislation or something that's on the ballot like that. But the difference is, of course, is how it gets there. Is it placed on there by the legislature or placed on there by the citizens? Now, another way in which you see direct democracy at work is this idea of recall. If you have, for example, an elected official who's not doing a good job or who's maybe involved in some kind of scandal, then basically the citizens can initiate a petition to remove that elected official from office before his or her term has officially expired. And so the whole process of a recall is, again, I think a good example of direct democracy in action. A lot of people like the idea of direct democracy because it seems to be a pure form of democracy. Here you are as a citizen making major decisions collectively with other citizens that affect your lives as a society, in society. And so we often think, that's a really, a very good way in which democracy should be practiced. But let me give you another type of democracy that we also see here quite a bit at work in the United States. And in fact, I would even make this argument that this form of democracy, that is a representative democracy, is actually the more dominant form of democracy that we have here in the United States. In the United States, we have a representative democracy and a direct democracy fully at work, but I think a representative democracy and the processes associated with that is the one that dominates. Now, what is a representative democracy? And by the way, this is also known as an overhead democracy, and another term is a republic. A republic is a form of government based upon a representative democracy. So when you're saying Pledge of Allegiance to the flag and the republic for which it stands, you're talking about, when you say republic, you're talking about a representative form of democracy. And again, what this is the people are governed indirectly through representatives. The people select representatives, and the representatives they select will act on their behalf. Okay? Now, even though we think that, we might think that direct democracy is more of a pure form of democracy, and therefore maybe a better democracy, in our system, in the United States, I would make the argument that a representative democracy predominates because it's really more effective for the nature and the context of our political system. And so what I want to suggest to you is why is that the case? Why is it that you'd want to have a representative democracy over a direct democracy? Well, let me give you some arguments in favor of a representative democracy over direct democracy. First of all, a direct democracy is not practical because it's impossible for the citizens to decide on all the important issues. People simply don't have the time, the energy, the interest, and the information to make good decisions. Now you think about this is kind of interesting. Many years ago, we would have never thought about the idea of citizens coming together and voting collectively all across the country at one point in time. We used to think about, like on a TV show, America's Funniest Videos, where all the audience is voting for their favorite videos and things like that, that you can capture that information very, very quickly. Well, even today here on the internet, for example, you could say, okay, we're going to have a vote between 6 o'clock this evening and 12 midnight, and everyone goes to this internet site, and it's secured, so you know that it's you casting the vote and those kinds of things. There are controls put in place. And you're going to vote for this major piece of legislation. And maybe it's some type of funding authorization for the next year for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And as part of this provision, you see that the NRC is going to be expanding its budget by $20 million or $60 million to engage in some additional safety initiatives, but you have no idea what these safety initiatives what they entail, because they're very technical and very kinds of complex kinds of things. And yet you're going to be asked to vote on this piece of legislation and under this environment, in this scenario, and be able to cast your vote. Should we cast this vote for increasing the budget for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for next fiscal year by the tune of $60 million to engage in these specific kinds of new activities? That's just a simple example, but as you can imagine, a lot of legislation is very complex that may deal with very technical kinds of issues that are beyond our scope. Do we have the time, the energy, the interest, or the information available to make these kinds of good decisions? And in many cases, that we do not. So a representative democracy in this regard is superior because we can elect representatives who can study these issues and over time become experts in these issues, and in the process, hopefully they will make good decisions that will be better or superior than what we as collective entity would be making under a direct democracy. Okay, so that's one of the arguments in favor of a representative democracy over a direct democracy, because direct democracy is simply not practical because it's impossible for the citizens to decide on all these issues. Now let me give you some other related arguments in favor of a representative democracy. People can make bad decisions based upon fleeting desires. In other words, public opinion can be easily swayed. And I'll just give you a simple example of that. Let's just say that you happen to see on the news some terrible tragic event where somebody comes into a restaurant or a school, and they begin to open fire with a semi-automatic machine gun, and they kill a lot of people all around. And it's just tragic. And people will then begin to immediately call for more restrictions in terms of gun control. We don't have enough restrictions on gun control. And so there might be some sweeping piece of an idea that's proposed, and asking the citizens to vote on this sweeping piece of legislation to really curtail the ownership of guns. A lot of people will be very, very upset about that because they recognize that we have a provision in our Constitution called the Second Amendment, which is the right to keep and to bear arms. And so in a lot of ways, might we potentially, in this scenario, craft a law that is so restrictive that we begin to violate the spirit and the intent and some of those provisions that are part of the Constitution? So the idea here is that, again, under a direct democracy, people can end up sometimes making bad decisions because public opinion can be easily swayed. When public opinion has a chance to cool off, they may not make the same kind of decision. Well, in a lot of ways, having the opportunity to debate an issue like gun control among seasoned legislators who've been thinking about and studying the issue and understand the pros and the cons, and understand on the one hand the need to promote safety in our society, but at the same time the need to uphold and protect our constitutional rights. And we don't want to, trying to craft the right balance between those two. Sometimes that takes a lot of time for debate, for researching the issues, and compromise, and crafting legislation that reflects that amalgam of information and compromise. And so because of that, again, the argument here is that this is another reason why a representative democracy is better than a direct democracy, at least as it works here in our democracy. A related issue, or third reason here, that is an argument in favor of a representative democracy is the idea as follows. Direct democracy makes compromise difficult. In other words, when you have a direct democracy, you're going to vote for this or vote against that. And it's often a very, very kind of simple kind of piece of legislation that might be proposed, either for it or against it. And so that basically tends to kind of create a win versus lose situation. You have winners and losers. Well, again, if you have the same type of issue and filter it through a representative body that can debate, discuss, consider compromises from that, so that the final product of the legislation actually embodies a lot of compromise, then that tends to produce a win-win situation. Not everybody gets what they want, but on the other hand, they can live with what we do have. And so the good thing about a representative democracy is that legislation can be crafted that embodies a lot of compromise that everyone will accept. No one is completely happy with the outcome, but everyone can accept that. And again, so it tends to create more of a win-win situation as opposed to a winners versus losers. And then again, a fourth related point, because a lot of these sort of reinforce each other, but some policies, as you might imagine, are so important and so complex and so technical, this especially kind of goes back to that first point, is they shouldn't be necessarily decided by a mere public opinion poll. Should we allow more particulates in the air of hydrochloric acid, or should we allow more arsenic in drinking water put out by public utilities, moving from 4 parts per million to 22 parts per million? Well, is that something that we really want to decide by a public opinion poll? I think that, again, we need to make sure that we have the best scientific evidence and to understand what are the long-term epidemiological implications in terms of long-term health of our society by these kinds of changes. And again, that's the kind of thing that we don't really want to consider in terms of a mere public opinion poll. So in any case, those are some of the arguments that are for a representative democracy over a direct democracy. Now again, we have both of those in place here in the United States, but really the representative democracy is one that is a much more appropriate one that we have here and is workable here for us in America. This is probably a good time to stop, and we'll continue our discussion. In our next segment of material, we're going to be continuing discussion of the material found in the first chapter. We'll be talking about different conditions necessary for democracies to exist, and we're also going to move into the topic of political ideologies, and hopefully through this you'll not only understand the distinctions between the major ideologies that are out there, major political ideologies that are out there, but also have a pretty good sense of your own political ideology. We'll wrap up that discussion also with a discussion of differences between the majoritarian and pluralist models of government, and then that'll wrap up our discussion here of Chapter 1. So this is Patrick Scott. We'll see you next time.